Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yeah.
Right, you're a scientist. So I was thinking about, we both have little kids. And like everybody says, oh, every little kid is an artist. Every little kid can be a scientist. They're all so creative and just curious about the world. And, like artist is kind of a job title depending on who you talk to and what state our civilization is in right now. But scientist, I feel like I think of that as a job title, right? So like every kid is just such a scientist, but like I think of it, you don't say like every kid's such a little manager, and it's very pejorative when you say every toddler is a little lawyer, right? Like that's certainly a job title, and you're using it in a negative way. But like how scientist? How you become scientist? Like, is it fair to say that every toddler, just because they're curious, is a little scientist? Like, how actually become scientist?
Well, darn it, Lions, I'm a scientist, not a philosopher. But I am a scientist, so with my general opinion, I will attempt to opine to this. Because it is very, it's opinion based, right? Is you can ask 10 quote scientists and get 10 different answers. So to your point, so let's first address the elephant in the room: is scientist a job title? And again, you could ask some people and they would say absolutely. I firmly disagree with that. I do not believe that being a scientist is a job. It is a philosophy or a method by which you approach problems or approach the universe. So if the question is how do you become a scientist as a job title, you go to college, you get a degree, and then they train you. Like womp done, end of episode. Yeah, like it's pretty straightforward. You have college advisors that will tell you exactly how to do that. But if you want to, even if you want to get that title, in my opinion, if you want to be a good scientist, whether you have the title or not, there are some things that you need to do. And we actually approached this recently. Well, not recently. God, it was almost a decade ago now. But, we were, going on a hike and just talking generally. And I was complaining about work, as one is wont to do. And you asked me a salient question, which was, do you remember how you phrased it?
I think you were in a different company then, and you had a fairly large department. And I think I said, how many scientists work for you or work on your team?
Yeah, you said, how many scientists work in your lab or something like that? Yeah. That was what it was. And I remember pausing for a minute and saying, I think what you're trying to ask me is how many analysts do I have versus how many administrators? Which is different than how many scientists that we have, And
so
I was like,
scathing.
and I said, so which do you want the answer to? And you're like, okay, both. And I said, we have probably out of 40 employees, we have about 30 analysts, and I would argue we have about 5 scientists. And because again, you have people who do quote unquote science, but then you watch the decisions that they make or the way that they handle other aspects of their lives or even their job. And you're like, this is terrible science. You are not a scientist. It is a scientist in name only. So, when I was thinking about this, is I said like, okay, what does one need? Because I wrote down a whole litany of stuff that I think is important to be a scientist, right? And then I said, well, some of these are way more my opinion. And I said, okay, so in my opinion, there are things that you need to do in order to be a good scientist. And then there are things that you need to do in order to be a great scientist, So in order to be a good scientist, 90% of it is employing the scientific method, like that's it, like there's some more stuff I'll touch on at the end of this section, but like 90% of it is right there. So, and you actually made an interesting point, which is, let's take a step back. Can you tell me what the scientific method is?
Ooh, I'm sure I wouldn't nail down the correct names for the steps, but it's the flow is something like you have to form a hypothesis, take measurements, like test your actual hypothesis, and then essentially like lather, rinse, repeat. So you believe that if you drop a bowling ball off top of a building that it will fall down and crack into the pavement, and before you have to decide like what is success, what is failure, essentially. Before you do it, you go out, you test your null hypothesis, and then you drop the bowling ball a bunch of times and measure it, right? I think, is it Adam Savage that said something like the difference between science and screwing around is just writing it down?
Yep. Yep, I quote that regularly to people because whenever somebody's like, "Oh, I did this analysis," I'm like, "Did you write it down?" They're like, "Nope." I'm like, "Then you were just screwing around."
Right.
So you don't write it down. Yes, no, absolutely agreed with that. So you got the gist. The actual first step, which you listed in your example, but you didn't expressly list, is you start with a question, right? So that's the very first step, which actually addresses the like, oh, babies are just such little scientists because they are curious about everything, right? So that's just the first step. So when you say they're a scientist, they did the first step. It's like, yeah, but they didn't do the other remaining and very important steps, right?
There's also, not to knock babies, but like there's a little bit of, for lack of a better term, like anthropomorphizing, where it's like, because a baby sticks their foot in their mouth does not mean that they had the conscious thought of like, what will my foot taste like?
Right. Exactly. Right. But so I would say that, again, like when we say using the scientific method, step one question. So I think that a important attribute is a genuine curiosity. Right. Like if you don't really care about how things or the world work, then, and it's not to say that not being a scientist is a bad thing, but it's just like, hey, maybe that's not where you want to leverage your efforts. Right. But, I find scientists regularly saying like, even when it's something that is a known quantity, right? They're like, man, I wonder how that works, and it's like, oh, okay, well, let's think it, like, let's go into it. Let's delve in. And then if you find joy in that, just like, even just raising the question and being like, let me figure that out. That's the genuine curiosity that starts with the question. It is a quality that I think is critical for a good scientist,
I can't remember the source of the quote right now, but you're reminding me of a line I heard that's like, the most exciting moment in science is when you say, that was unexpected, right? Because then it's like a new thing to figure out.
Yep. When actually that's similar to a quote that, and this may be the quote that you're thinking of that I use regularly, which is you only learn something when you're wrong, Yeah,
that's definitely, I'm sure both of us have trotted that out at our children.
Oh, absolutely. Because people are like, you like to be right, but then you didn't learn anything. You've confirmed existing knowledge, but when it's like, oh, well, that didn't go the way I expected it to. What happened there? So that genuine curiosity. Then step two is generally background research, right? So you don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. So you go and you see, hey, has somebody else done this thing? And what did they find out, right? And so you kind of, and so you start to say like, okay, let me ask questions. And more importantly is that if somebody says something, like says a thing where they're like, if you're like, how does thing A work? And somebody posits, it works by method B. Genuinely try to break that, right? Like go approach it, because you can't prove a hypothesis. You can only disprove a hypothesis, right?
Wait, is the term for that, is that falsifiability?
Maybe that doesn't.
I'm going to say it is.
Yeah. Works for me. But yeah, is because if somebody asserts, like, oh, a bowling ball, will always fall from the roof, and it's like, that confirms my existing biases, but let me think about this. Will it always fall from a roof? Can I think of edge cases where it wouldn't fall from a roof? And then that will help inform you on why it's falling from a roof. So for example, right, is if you said like, oh, a bowling ball will always fall from a roof. And let's say that you've got somebody who's learning, right? You could potentially counter that with saying, what if the building was in outer space? Would it still fall from the roof? And it's like, well, no. And it's like, okay, that's good. Now we're learning something because we have disproven our hypothesis, right? Or our initial thought. It's just like, okay, but now you're starting to hone in on why does it fall from the roof? It must have something to do with being on the planet Earth versus being in outer space. Now we can start to hone that down even more. But what if we were on Venus? Do we still think it would fall from the roof? Yes. Okay, so maybe it's planets in general. Maybe there's some quality inherent to large masses that causes things to fall from roofs, right? So beyond that, then after you've done your background research, then you form a hypothesis, and this is interesting. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. What would you argue is the most important thing of a hypothesis?
Oh, this may actually be where I got that word from is it has to be falsifiable. You can't have something for which will always be true, because then what are you testing?
Right, exactly. It has to be able to be disproven, you know? Yeah, because like if you just say so, and that's interesting because like one of the things that I personally think is fascinating is the idea of multiverse theory, right? It's like, oh, you know, there's an infinite number of universes and all this kind of stuff. But if you ask any scientist worth their salt, they'd be like, you know, do you believe in multiverse theory? And it's like, well, it's pseudoscience. And the reason why it's pseudoscience is because it is not disprovable. There's no way to disprove it, so therefore it's a fun thought, but it's not science, you know? At least not right now to our knowledge. Now, goodness knows what crazy things super scientists will come up with. But, you know, in this cross-section of time, it's pseudoscience, you know, a fun thought experiment. So then beyond that, you then test and analyze data, right? So during your test, you want to the important thing when you're testing a hypothesis is, one, you want to use a systems-based approach, right? You assume that a system works a certain way and in a repeatable way. You want to try to isolate that and look at that. So you want to try to isolate out any variables that could not be a part of the system, right? So make your system as simple as possible, which is why like those do you remember doing any of those like calorimeter experiments where you like put a thermometer in a thing in boiled water and then, you know, like added ice to it and like all that kind of stuff?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yep. So the reason why that is such a famous experiment is because it's so easy to isolate 90% of your variables, right? Where it's like, I am testing this one thing, you know? So isolating variables, systems-based approach, and you want to use strong root cause analysis during your test, right? To kind of say like, okay, am I testing the root cause of why this is happening, or am I testing a knock-on effect, you know? So, you know, when, for example, and even when, you know, if you were using the scientific approach for like, well, you know, why did Jim throw all of those samples in the garbage, you know? And it's like, well, you could go, well, Jim's crazy, right? Or you could say like, okay, well, let's think it. What would cause him to do that, right? And so you start to drill down to the root cause, which is then testable, you know, as opposed to just like, oh, well, we'll just tell Jim not to do it again. And then when you're analyzing the data, and this is where a lot of scientists, and it's, again, systems-based approach, it's because the system is set up to incentivize this bad behavior. When you're analyzing the data, you need to be trying to genuinely disprove your hypothesis, right?
Right. Which is in a because I mean, I have a background in academia, right? So I've worked at a lot of R1 universities, and it's like, okay, so your job, your livelihood, your career, and your happiness are all predicated on getting published. So nobody wants to publish null findings. So get out there and find some new truth, which is really at odds.
Yes. Yeah. With the stated goal of finding truth, right? You know, where it's like, hey, I need you to find new truth. It's like, okay, you know, I'll do my best. It's like, yeah, but you know, if you don't, I'm not going to like feed you. It's like, behold this new truth I found. And it's like, you're not incentivizing great behavior there. So yes, you want to genuinely try to disprove your hypothesis. And this is one of the things that, you know, again, like this isn't truly the scientific method. This is more of a philosophical back and forth. But one of the things that like, I always appreciated about some of the conversations that we had with each other and then with other people where, you know, you might assert something. And even though I agree with your assertion, I might take up the other side of it to say, well, let's actually put this in a crucible and see if I can disprove it. Right. You know? And I remember sometimes, you know, like, or you would be trying to disprove me, but like, I would say like something where I'd be like, well, what about thing A? And I'd be like, I don't believe thing A and I think it's horrible. But it is a counter to your argument. So like we now need to, if we don't think that human beings are innately evil, then we need to address this elephant in the room, which I don't like or believe, but it's a problem and we got to talk about it, right? You know? So the same thing with testing and analyzing the data is you're trying to genuinely disprove, because ideally you're not trying to prove yourself right, you are trying to figure something out. And those are two completely different things, which also is another piece of it, which is you need to be dispassionate. You know, you need to be approaching problems with like I think I know what's going on here, but if I'm wrong, then you know what? I learned something, you know? So as opposed to like, oh, I think I might be wrong, so I'm going to do everything I can to try to twist facts and make myself right.
So you may be intending to touch on this, but would you want to have like a two keys approach here where like I'm the one who formed the hypothesis, and then somebody else takes the measurements, and then someone else actually analyzes the data. And maybe you don't even know as the data analyzer what you're looking for. You're just like, hey, this is what this data shows. Like there's these trends, or we got spikes at this, energy level or whatever, like just however it shakes out. And so then, you kind of have like you're isolating knowledge of what to lie about from each person, basically.
Yeah. Well, kind of what you're describing is basically the peer review process, So the idea is that
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, so where I'm like, hey, I did a thing, and I think that I was dispassionate. I think I did good science, but I need somebody who is not as invested as me to double check me and say, yeah, no, they did good science, or no, dude, this is terrible science.
Well, and actually, that is a place where having passion for it may serve the goal instead of working against it. Because it's like, oh, I hate that guy. I want to prove him. I want to find faults in their data, right? And so, like, I'm gonna go through with a fine tooth comb, and then if I can't find any faults, then no, they must have done good science. Darn them.
It's and I agree, co-sign all of that, and as we are talking about generally in an isolated environment, that is absolutely a good thing. Yeah. It can have some negative knock-on effects, but it makes me, what you just said makes me think of one of my favorite Dragon Ball Z abridged quotes, which if any of our listeners haven't seen it, they should. Where Piccolo is talking to Nail in his head, and he goes like, they're trying to figure out cool new names for their new attack, and they're just listing off like other like random attacks, like Rasengan, and Gum Gum Pistol or whatever, and he goes like, Super Death Beam, and he goes, Nail Gun? That's good. Like... because that's in theory, right? If I'm the peer reviewer and I'm like, I don't like that guy, and I go through it, ideally at the end of it, you'd be like, ugh, but that is good science, though. He's right. Or actually an even better example of another great story that I love was you and I, it was for your bachelor party. You and I and a group of other dudes were watching The Expendables, if I remember correctly.
That sounds right.
Yep, and then at one point, and we're all kind of passively watching it, but there were some people that were actively watching. And one of the people that was actively watching, because we were talking about something else, is said, one person said, we have 120 seconds to do this thing, and the person said, why don't they just say 2 minutes? And I just called out, I'm like, because the 120 seconds is a more precise measurement. And the person turned around and he said, no, he's right. Just don't.
Because I could see them winding up to argue with you.
It's like, no, don't. I know it was a pedantic correction and George didn't need to say anything, but don't go any further with it. And then the final step is then drawing your conclusions. You've now done all of the work. You then draw a conclusion based off of the evidence that is shown. And so that's, like I said, that's 90% of it to be a good scientist. The last piece I would argue that is critical to being a good scientist is finding at least one, ideally several good mentors over your life. You are never going to be a island unto yourself. We are all pieces of a continent, a part of the main, right? So we have to seek out those who have gone before us that we think have learned this and can point out pitfalls that we could not possibly find on our own, right? But then you want to be careful on who you pick as a mentor. You want to look at them holistically, because even if you're like, they do the best science that ever scienced, but their life is in shambles. So maybe only listen to them about the science bits and not the other bits. But I've been very fortunate throughout my career that I have been, I actually, interestingly, with all of my supervisors who are in turn, especially in the science field, my mentors, right? I've been very fortunate in that I've had an amazing mentor and then a terrible mentor, and then an amazing one and then a terrible one. So from the amazing one, I was able to learn good things to do, and from the terrible one, I was able to learn good things to avoid. Right. And so having those alternations almost to a T has been very helpful to me, but it is something that I think is very important. If you want to become a good scientist, you need to seek out somebody who is already a good scientist that can help guide you in the process.
Well, and two things. One, what everybody wants to know right now is, are you on an odd number job or an even number job? Don't say, but surely someone is like, I wonder if he's on an odd number or an even number job.
If these weren't date and time stamped, I might answer it.
But two, it sounds like, and I hope I'm not writing a big check for you, but I love that inclusion of science is a collaborative thing. And you need to learn from hopefully good scientists or counterexamples from bad scientists. but that feels like a real bridge into what you think is necessary to be a great scientist.
It very much so is, actually. So because one of the quotes that I heard when I was very young, and one of the things I found with a lot of quotes is that, like, initially you hear the quote and you're like, I like that quote, that's good. And then later on you're like, no, that's a fundamental, like that. I now fully understand it, having more life experience, like learned more, which is we stand upon the shoulders of giants, you know? Like, I am able to do the science that I can do because of all of those who have pioneered before me, right? And it's the whole, like, you know more about the way the world works than Leonardo da Vinci did. That's not to say that you're smarter, but it is to say that you have a fundamental understanding of of chemistry and physics and biology, and you're like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, like, obviously glucose is or eating anything that's sugary is going to raise your glucose levels because, you know, that's just how the body works. And it's like, wait, there's not miasma and 4 humors, and what are we doing?
That dope.
Yeah, silly man. So in order to become a great scientist, like, there are some things that I think require. These are going to sound like things that they are not related to science, but I think that they are important to create a mens rea that you carry with you that allows you to do good science, you know? And so one of the things that somebody said to me a while back, and man, I recoiled at it so hard because I was like, I don't like that. I don't like that philosophy. And then I came around because they, in my opinion, are absolutely correct, which is, what do you think is one of the, you could list tons of things. So list a thing and I'll say, you're right, but it's not the thing I want to say. What would you argue is one of the biggest cornerstones of science, like or that is required of science?
As a field of study, as an industry?
If I wanted to be a great scientist, what is something that I need to, a quality that I need to have, you know?
Ooh, well, I'll just go with curiosity because we talked about it earlier, but I'm going to say, like, you have to be just fundamentally curious about the thing you are studying.
Absolutely. And to your point, right, is that because if you're genuinely curious, you're going to put a ton more effort into it. One of the ones that is one that I would argue is very overlooked, and also I would argue that most scientists would have my initial reaction to it as well. Faith. Faith is incredibly important in science, which sounds weird because those two things are often put on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? But the thing is that if you asked me, like, how does nuclear fission work, is I'd say, like, okay, well, and this is off the top of my head, but it's like, okay, well, you know, we use, you know, high energy neutrons that, like, hit the nucleus, and then that destabilizes it, and then it splits apart into their component parts. Now ask me if I have ever run that experiment.
So it is, because I had an idea where I thought you might be going, but you're saying, so you essentially have to take faith in the science you have not personally done.
Correct. Yes. I have to have faith in other scientists that they did good science, because I can't possibly prove everything myself.
Right.
You know? And isn't that kind of an interesting...
It is. I mean, I guess you start to get into, like, a proving spiral where you would say, like, well, I'm gonna build a machine and it needs to have this level of tolerance, and I haven't tested that this steel has that level of tolerance, but these people did, and I'm using steel that exactly meets those specs, so I'm just going to have faith that it will work. And then if it works, you don't really know that it works because of the reason they said it works. You just know that it worked, right? Which is, to your point, you can't, like, test every single thing.
Right. And so the quality then, I would say, is important, is be careful where you put your faith. You know, that's the critical part about being in my opinion, a great scientist, right? Where it's just like, you know, I have faith in scientists that came before me. I have faith in people who have shown that, like, you know, this science, for example, like Heisenberg's work, Einstein's work, right? Like, I don't need to do the proofs myself because I have faith that they knew what they were doing, and people way smarter than me have proven it 17 times over, right? So until I hear anything else, I have faith in certain news, in certain scientific journals. I do not have faith in other scientific journals for certain reasons, right? So you just need to be careful about, because faith is a critical aspect of science, but you have to be careful how you divvy it out, you know?
Yeah. This is making me think of like trust falls, right?
Yes.
It's like any of these people could catch me if I did a trust fall, but I trust them to catch me and I do not trust them to catch me. Right. So it's very like, it can be done. This person could have done good science, but do I believe that they did?
Right. Yes. Yeah. No, it's yeah, like I said, when like I said, the first time somebody said like, "Oh, faith is critical for science," I was like, "No, those are two different things." And then as I learned and as they explained it to me, I'm like, you know what it was? As they explained it to me and they walked me through it, I was like, I still don't like that, but he's right. You know, like it's that same feeling where it's like, I don't like it, but here we are. So the next thing I think is important. So again, like, being a great scientist, right? Where it's just like, well, you're doing the scientific method, but you're not careful on where you put your faith. So that causes a lot of problems in your process. So you will be a good scientist because the scientific method will bear out those issues if you are following it and following it diligently, but you can bypass a lot of heartache if you're just careful where you put your faith. And then, so the second out of three for the great scientist is, be careful with what you know versus what you've assumed, you know? And I think that that's something that we very quickly can get away from, right? Where it's just like, oh, well, everybody who, has a great curiosity could be a great scientist. It's like, do you know that, or have you made an assumption, you know? Or like, everybody in Colorado loves the mountains, and it's like, that's clearly an assumption. And those are easy to see, right? But one of the ones that I was talking to recently, and it's just and again, you want to thread the needle of not being overly pedantic, especially in polite conversation. But this whole podcast is about being overly pedantic. So here we go. Is that I was talking to somebody and they said like, oh, well, they said to put the heat onto like a mid-range heat, but since it would take about 10 minutes to do a thing, but they were like, so the mid-range heat is 5 and it goes up to 10, so I cranked it up to 10 and I did it for half the time, kind of a thing. So I would get twice as hot.
Yeah.
And
bake this cake for 5 minutes at 900 degrees.
Right. And not only is that an assumption that would work, but the other thing that I threw at them is I said, doesn't that assume that your stovetop's heat progresses linearly? That the 2 is twice as hot as a 1.
Yeah. 3 is 50% hotter than 2. Right.
Right. And I was like, I'm not sure that that's something that they would even care to check at the, manufacturing thing. So I'm like, and again, that's just one thing where it's just like, oh, well, yeah, I know that. It's like, no, you've assumed that. And it's fine to make that assumption, but you need to know that it's an assumption. It's not a known, it's a potential variable. Because then when things don't turn out your way, you have to be like, okay, let me go back and check the assumptions I made. One of those may be wrong,
Yeah. It is fun in those situations, and I'm sure you have found yourself in these situations because I know I have, but it is funny when you try to gently be like, someone's like, oh, hey, I'm gonna just crank it up to 10 and then it'll be exactly like I saw in that cooking show. And it's like, well, I mean, you're assuming that it's going to work the same way. You might want to follow the recipe. And like, oh, no, I only have half the time, so I'm going to do it at twice the heat. And it's like, well, for one thing, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. But, you do you fine, whatever. Just, you know better than everybody about everything. So I don't even know why we're talking about this. And then and it's just like, you see people deflate under like all the things they realized they were assuming. Like, oh, that guy was using a copper pot and you're using a cheap aluminum pot. And that guy was at sea level and you are in the mountains. And that guy was using oil and you're using a different kind of oil that has a different boiling temperature. Just like, just totally ruin their entire program. Then they get mad.
Which is, yeah, they do. Which is honestly why a lot of the times I struggle with cooking and baking, because like I get so mired into making sure I'm doing it exactly like the recipe / standard operating procedure.
So you're on the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah, no, it slows me way down because it's just like, Yeah, where it said like, okay, you need to use 3/4. Here's a great example of it that drives me banana pants crazy is that, I've got measuring cups, right? And it's like, add 2 cups of flour and then add 2 cups of milk for like a waffles recipe because I make waffles. I love making waffles. Kids love them. It's great. But like, I'm like, okay, what's a cup? I mean, like, I get that cup, measuring cup is about a cup, but is it like, it's not a heaping cup. Like I can probably say that for sure. But when I like crest it, like I cut it off at the top and I'm like, that is a cup, it doesn't come out right. So I'm like, okay, so clearly a cup is slightly less than that, but then did I add enough milk? And then
So what smart cooks do and a lot of like Europeans and Asians do? Wait.
Mass.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Because 200 grams of flour gets you around things like how tightly packed is the flour. A friend of mine just got a home espresso machine, and they were packing the grounds in, and you do have to pack them to a point, right?
Right.
but you're doing it by hand, so it's like kind of a thing you feel out. And the first one, they just way overpacked, and the like no water came out of the machine. And I was like, that's be careful when you open that because like water is going to go flying everywhere.
Yep. And that's the thing is that they had a hypothesis. This is how tightly I need to pack this.
Yeah.
They then tested
turned
it.
out no.
Turns out that was not. And actually, one of the things I said this to Megan recently. She came downstairs after putting the kids to bed, and I said, like, I just need you to know how emotionally stressful it is for me to make pasta for you, because when you say make me pasta. And I said, how much would you like me to make? And she says, the right amount.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, it's not 2 cups. It's not nothing. It's just like, what feels right. And I'm like, there's so many variables here. And I'm like, I just need you to know, I'm going to keep doing it because I love you. And she hasn't complained about it yet, but I'm like, it stresses me out, man. As I'm like, because I pour some in, I'm like, is that enough? Is that the amount I added the last time? It feels like it's covering the bottom completely. And that's the important bit. But that was a little bit low. So I need to cover it. But then, it's a mess. So,
it's nice every once in a while when a small part of your life is like a decently written sitcom. Because like, that's so ridiculous. But like, I've met your wife. Like, I know that that's a true story.
Yep, absolutely. Because she's like, I don't know, you just eyeball it, and then because when I first said to her, she said, like, "Can you make me pasta?" I said, "Oh yeah, how much would you want me to make?" And she goes, "Oh no, just eyeball it." I literally said to her, "I don't know what I was expecting. Like that's the only answer you were ever going to give me." So, okay, let's just take a swing. So far, I would argue that the scientific method is something that's very easily teachable, trainable, right? You can look it up online. You can kind of follow its precepts. We teach it in elementary school. It's a fairly easy step, right? So you can get that one locked into your tool belt pretty quickly. Getting a good mentor, ideally several, right? Like that's a little bit more difficult, but it can be done, right? Being careful where you put your faith, that's something that's more difficult, but you can kind of start to learn and lock that down pretty quickly. The same thing with being careful with what you know versus what you've assumed. To me, the last part is the part that allows you to, aside from gaining knowledge in a subject matter, right? The thing that is the constant journey for all scientists to becoming a better scientist. And when you stop trying to develop in this area is when you cease to become continue to be a better, well-rounded scientist. You may become more knowledgeable, but your journey as a complete scientist has started to slow or halt, which is to know yourself, right? You have to know your biases and assumptions, and you have to constantly be studying because you as a person constantly change, right? So if you want to be a great scientist, you need to be able to look at yourself and say, okay, I think I did amazing science here, but I am biased. How could I be biased? And then you start to run those down and say like, well, I'm looking at this from my point of view. This is my background. So maybe I should add something in to compensate for the fact that I grew up in these areas with these values. Maybe I should make sure that I'm getting more opinions from different walks of life, different thoughts, different cultures, different beliefs, different faiths, all of these different things in order to better foundationally understand who I am and the lens that I'm looking through in order to do this science that I am trying to do.
And I think that's, first off, that's lovely. I love that. But second, I think that also speaks very strongly to you can apply science to things that are fuzzier, like the human mind and society and stuff, right? Like you can also have a question, form a hypothesis, take measurements, analyze the data, right? All of that still works. And the less macro and concrete the thing you're studying is, so if you're, like gravity is like, we have a pretty firm grasp on how that works at this point, right? But it's pretty concrete and it's pretty like outside of human control at the moment. Whereas like, how do societies work? How do people work? How does the brain work? Was it not socioeconomics, but the other behavioral economics, right? Like psychology, you can do good science about all those things. But I think people probably phone in a lot of everything you just said because they're like, oh, well, it's squishy and it's hard to be precise. And it's like, right, but that's your bias. Your bias is like, oh, well, I'll just fudge this because it's hard. And it's like, no, you need to be more rigorous. You need to have more eyes or whatever will compensate for the flaws in your system, right? Otherwise, you're going to do bad science.
To your point, right, is that every measurement that's ever taken has precision and accuracy. And it's just very important that you're very clear on what is your precision, accuracy, and uncertainty, right? So for example, and then make decisions and assumptions based off of that, right? So it's okay to have a super squishy number as long as you know it's a super squishy number, So when somebody's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter that I do good science because this number is super squishy. It's like, that's going to make it way squishier and by extension, probably more useless. The squishier number is the less usable applications it has. And actually, on that note, the thing I always say to people to give an example of precision versus accuracy is because typically the more precise you are, the less likely it is that you're accurate, right? So the example that I always give is, let's say we're going out to eat and you want to know how much is it going to cost, right? Is if I say, okay, it's going to cost somewhere between $1,000 and $1,000, right? That is not useful information to you, but I'm right.
Yeah. The answer's almost definitely in there. It's not very precise.
I can say with 99.9999999% confidence that when we go to McDonald's, it will be somewhere between $0 and $1,000, but not very helpful. So then people will be like, oh, well, no, give me a precise number. It's like, okay, it'll cost $10.52. It's like, well, that's probably not right. It's like, no, but it's a super precise measurement. Did you like that? So you got to thread the needle between both, having, a wide enough window that you are likely to be accurate, but not so wide that, your precision's shot to hell. So I say all that to say that to your point, is that a lot of times people are like, oh, because this isn't a physical science, it's okay to be more lax on our controls. It's like, no, that means you need to be less lax on your controls, and you are more. And if you're, less, the fact that it's squishier, a lot of times it means people are less careful with what they know versus what they've assumed. They're less careful. They're like, oh, well, I saw this article on this thing. That's probably right. It's like, nope, that's putting your faith in the wrong place. And then on top of that, they're like, oh, well, I'm studying this psychology thing because I'm really passionate about it, which, as we said in the beginning, is very important, right? But your passion about it may mean that you are more likely to be blind to some of the biases and assumptions that you're making, and you need to know that about yourself, So it's all the Aristotelian ethics. It's all the median between two extremes.
Yeah. No, this is good. I also feel like I'm doing several of these things, so I at least get a passing grade, right? But I now know what I need to work on to be a better scientist myself. And unsurprisingly, this reminds me of more science I want to ask you about.